Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 60, Embroidery Adjacent Tools and Skills. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. It is a lovely Friday afternoon. I'm getting buttoned up for this. I have to say, this particular topic is so big that I had trouble isolating what I wanted to talk to you about today. There is so much that I would have if I could. And honestly, I'm going to try not to keep this into major bonus time today. I'm going to just cover some categories and discuss some of the things that people have been asking me, because in the last week, I've had several questions from people saying, all right, what do you use for this? What do you use for that? What kind of software is this? How do you manage this? How do you manage that? And frankly, there's been so many of them that I thought I would bring you just some of my favorite stuff. And I think that it's kind of a fun exercise just to say, here are some of the things that I use on a daily basis that I have used throughout my career, and talk about some of the skills I think that are useful that are what I'm calling embroidery adjacent. It's more like things that have been useful in my embroidery career that may or may not be directly related to digitizing software, embroidery itself. So today I want this to be really loose. I would like to hear about what things you find to be super valuable in your embroidery world, and what you find valuable in all facets of being an apparel decorator, a crafter, an artist, whatever it is that you do that brings you here to talk about embroidery. I would love to hear more from you too. So I'm really hoping for some interaction today to hear more from you guys, and I'm going to share a little bit about some of the stuff that I really use and love, and honestly, we'll see where it takes us. This is going to be a little bit more free form than usual, maybe probably a little bit looser than usual, because I'm going to follow what I think we're all enjoying, because honestly, I think that lots of you folks really love to hear tools and see what people use. I know I certainly love it whenever I get to talk to people about this, and I actually managed to get you guys a cool little offer from one of the people whose resources I really love. So we're going to have some good stuff to share with you today, but I certainly want to talk to everybody and see what it is that you use. So think about this. In your embroidery life, outside of your embroidery software, outside of your machine, outside of the tools you use to clean up your actual embroidery or your files, what is it that you use the most? What is it that makes the most difference to you in your business, in your art? And what would you like to share with other people? Because I want to hear about it. So let's go ahead and say hi to some of the people who are in already today. Number one, we have Jeff Fuller of the Embroidery Nerd and Fuller Embroidery Works, and he's saying, Education Friday, excited to be here. I am too. I certainly wish I could have gotten a little more form together today about what I want to talk about. There were so many things I wanted to bring in. I have sitting around me, it looks like a bomb went off, because I have stacks of books, I have tools everywhere, I have all these things that I want to show you, because I feel like an excited kid at show and tell who wants to just give you all of the different stuff that I love to use. But we'll get to all these different things and see what kind of skills you guys agree with and see what you like too. But yeah, Education Friday is always great. Had a great time this morning. If you missed the Two Regular Guys, the number two, regularguys.com. This morning we had Jay Bucell on and Jeff Solomon on from Tacos with Jay and Jeff, and they talked about promotional products, and they talked about teaching and lots of other things they did, but really awesome kind of people who are about giving back, very much like you guys, the reciprocator community. And so I've really enjoyed Education Friday today. But like I said, real free form today. I want to talk about all these different tools, and we'll discuss kind of the why and the where for, and what I use things for, and how these are both valuable to me and embroidery adjacent. So let's say hi to a few more people while we have everybody here. Kathleen says, hi. Hi, Kathleen. Happy to see you in. Christine Shreve, who I've seen a bunch online today. And by the way, congratulations again to Christine Shreve for her new position with Applique Getaway. You'll see more from her soon. Good afternoon, Eric. I gave in to the lure of the chicken wings, ordered some for dinner. Yeah, chicken wings were happening on the Two Regular Guys. You guys don't know the Two Regular Guys show, and I'll show you my branded mug. You see that it has the Eric Campbell stuff on it, which I know you guys want merch. We'll talk about merch. It's stuff is coming, because I have been bombarded today with discussions of both why I need to embroider my gear, and I agree, because I tell people to wear their own work and I need to have some embroidered work, and because everybody wants merch. Which, by the way, next week going on Two Regular Guys, I'll be talking to Jeremy Picker about merch, and that'll be really interesting too. So I'll let you guys know about the Takeup takeover of the Two Regular Guys next week. But I'll also show you that we have Two Regular Guys here Why is this interesting? The Tubular Guys logo has a big chicken wing in it, and wings are a big thing for those guys because their entire show started. Our show started originally with Terry Combs and Aaron Montgomery eating wings and having beers after trade shows. That is how that all started. So, yeah, the chicken wing thing has become a thing for the Tubular Guys community. And as the producer of that podcast and show, me too, I guess. Though I have to say, being from New Mexico, chicken wings, burritos and green chili and Christmas all day. Chicken wings, okay, I guess so. But let's go ahead and go from this. Let's see who else is in. We have Justin from Sweden. Hi, happy to have you in. Cindy King from Texas is in. Frank Dunn from the UK. Love to see you in. And thank you, Frank, for sharing. I had some technical difficulties last week with my engine sharing, and Frank stepped in. And he stepped in again today so hard that when I went to go share my show, he had already shared it everywhere. Thank you, Frank. You're an awesome reciprocator and an awesome guy helping with education and being one of the helpers. And by the way, if anybody tells you not to help when you're helping or curses you for doing that without worrying about money, well, hey, you know what? It's the people in the arena who are helping and doing the right thing that all of this belongs to, and all the critics can't say anything about it. Anyway, Lori, happy to see you here. Hello. Jeff, part 4, 3, 2, and 1 tomorrow. Yeah, I know. I could do this for hours. I could talk about all my tools for hours. Gary from Richardson, Texas, near Dallas. Happy to have you in, Gary. Clorinda is in. Happy to see you too. Clorinda, hello. Excited to talk about this myself. Mary Ann from Santa Fe is going on. Brian Bailey, creator of Embrilliance, who has been a very busy man. If you haven't seen what we've released for Embrilliance in this last week, then you won't know why. So he is so busy. But yeah, he has been absolutely busy on the coding side of things. And I've been a little busy myself too. You'll find a couple of things in there that I helped out with. Jeff saying this, and I'm going to go ahead and say this right now. I'm going to get into it. Why not? Jeff saying, I would say my second best item I would have, it would be my heat press. Need a better one, but the random stuff I use it for makes it very worth it. Before I even get into other tools that are embroidery adjacent, absolutely. I think the first thing, if you're looking for equipment to expand an embroidery-only shop, the absolute first thing you should look at is a heat press. With a heat press, even before you have a cutter, even before you have a desktop sublimation printer, no matter what else you have, you can now order transfers in that do sublimation, transfers that are plastisol like screen printing, white toner transfers, rhinestone pre-populated transfers, applique with heat applied materials on it, heat applied material and glues so that you can make patches that are heat applied or apply them yourself. Heat pressings, absolutely. A good heat press is the first thing you should add after embroidery machine. 100% pressure plus heat, and all of these adhesives and substrates and films can make all kinds of really cool stuff happen. Also lets you do things like rip away applique, with which without a cutter, we can take glitter flake or other heat transfer vinyl products, put a sheet over something, run a design that's nice and open that has satin stitches around the edge, rip away the excess, heat press the rest of it down, and it looks like we have an applique with zero cutting. So yeah, heat press, awesome addition. And even though that's not where I was going with decoration yet, you won't see a lot of that today. I'm trying to go a little further afield. Absolutely add a heat press, and I would say heat presses and a cutter as well. Cutters, I do like things like the Graphtec, the Roland, a little bit more commercial, perhaps a little bit more industrial than, you know, the Crickets and the, you know, Silhouettes, those things. Not that they are not capable enough as they are, but I like a nice big wider format cutter. And you can use them from everything from straight up applique, vinyl cutting, sign making, because you can use regular sign vinyl after you've done that. You get some transfer tape and sign vinyl. That's an entirely new area you can enter. And you can do things like cutting flocking that can be used. Not only can you use flocking for decoration, you can use flocking as rhinestone masks, so you can make your own brush and bake rhinestone transfers. So yeah, two things to add to an embroidery shop: heat press, absolutely, and a cutter. I think those are very valuable things to have. So anyway, I'll just say that. Lisa, who says, your desk sounds like mine on a normal day. Bold of you to assume my desk isn't covered in stuff every other day. But yes, today especially, it's covered in a lot of stuff. And I see everybody's talking in the comments to each other. That is awesome. So everybody's doing well. And Maureen, great, putting some coffee on. I wish I had put some on before I started. I do, however, have my water, which I'll probably partake in today. I've been talking a bit, so I could use a little bit of water there. Robert's in. Christine, absolutely. Thank you. Are welcome for the support. You deserve it. And I love to see everybody talking in the comments to each other. That's awesome. Pam, hello, Pam. Christine says, I need to watch that show next week and get merch. Yeah, merch for Women in Garment Decoration Group and your podcast. Merch, I think, is bigger and bigger, and I keep seeing people doing more and more merch for podcasts, for streamers, for individual personalities. People really identify with them and now want merch. And like I said, Multiple people have already asked me. They've said, when are we getting the Eric head patch? I don't know if that's happening or when or if, but if it happens, you'll hear it here first. So we'll talk about that. Letty is in. Virginia is in from Alaska. Awesome. Maggie is in. And here we are. Definitely, Christine. Yeah, I definitely agree with the advice about the heat press. It's so versatile and useful. Good investment for almost any shop. Absolutely. If you do embroidery, a heat press will be useful for you. Yeah, I agree with this one. Our sewing lab needs a heat press for sure. Thinking stalls, but suggestions are welcome. Yeah, stalls, George Knight. Those are great heat presses. Hicks. There's a lot of good presses. I love the Stalls Hottronic series. I've used them, so I love them. And the new stuff, the new 360 ID cap press is really impressive. I got to see that when it first came out live before we all got shut down. So it was pretty awesome. So love that stuff. And yeah, and I agree with this with Gary. There's another thing. A heat cap press. We use our heat cap press to help out some caps for embroidery. Super hard embroidery sometimes, or super hard caps when you go to embroider them, you can have trouble with the buckram lining inside, that plastic lawn chair looking material inside, if you don't know, the stiffener. And sometimes heat can absolutely make them soft or make them easier to run. My answer to that, though, eventually is to stop using hats that have that horrible stuff in them if you can, or there are other hats that still have a nice stiff crown that don't have quite the worst stuff. So I would say big deal there. And let's go ahead and a couple more comments before I get in, because I love these comments. You guys are really rocking it out, and I love this. So let's go. A couple more things. Yeah, Jeff, absolutely. You can purchase transfers, so you just need a heat press. Absolutely. That's what I was saying before. You can purchase all that stuff, and then as you grow your market, you can actually get into cutting your own transfers or doing desktop sublimation. It's really not that expensive to get started, so really awesome. Jeff also said, second most used thing is my sewing machine. Other than that, I need a thread ripper, hopefully on the horizon. Yeah, no, totally. Sewing machine, classic sewing machine, always good to use. The shops that I've worked in always had a small sewing bay with a few industrial sewing machines. I'll admit that that's just something to have for sure. And yeah, I've never heard a negative about a Stahl's heat press. Pretty much. There are always people who have a failure of some part on any press. I will say, compared to random kind of import press that you buy on Amazon, those often have cold spots, stuff like that you might not love. And Jeff, you're right. Jeff has asked when we're getting the Eric sticker. That may be the way to go. And by the way, here, love this. Different experience here. Brian comes in. He's got experience in cut and sew. If you don't know cut and sew, actually creating garments, cut and sew. Not everybody knows the term, but if you don't, in my old cut and sew business, the grommet press was constantly used as was the double needle chain stitcher for banner blanks. Yeah, absolutely. Used quite a lot of those banner blanks doing vinyl signage, and the webbing hot cutter. Yeah, hot cutters for sure. And Christine says George Knight, she loves those too. Great. And yeah, heat gun. Heat gun for sure. Once again, I was going adjacent outside of embroidery, but I'm going to go ahead and go with this because you guys are rolling. I'm absolutely going to talk about this stuff. Heat gun is very useful. I really like heat guns that have the ability to dial the temperature up and down, because honestly, heat guns are super useful for dealing with 3D foam. I think 3D foam, you really need a heat gun. I've seen people do it with lighters. I've done it myself. The problem is that white thread especially shows scorch marks very easily, and open flame around thread on hats, there's a good chance of scorching, there's a good chance of melting. And with 3D foam, really wide columns, when you get to the ends of the columns, there are sometimes isolated stitches that are pretty loose that are not really protected in a big mass. And if you run flame over them, sometimes you can melt those pretty easily. So heat gun is great, and being able to dial it down so you just use the heat you need is a great way to go. And also, yeah, heat gun can also be used for those really hard, those really difficult caps. Sometimes I've seen people soften up the seam on a super difficult hard cap with a heat gun as well. But yeah, heat gun, super awesome thing to have. And I wasn't going to go over all the embroidery tools. I will say, hey guys, a mass set of indelible ink markers. So when you have a teeny tiny piece of bobbin thread coming up, you don't foul a garment over it. Absolutely. Good scissors, solid, good fabric scissors, solid, good trimmers. We all know those are important. I will also say a knitting needle or something that is not sharp that you can use to poke foam back in. There's another great one there. And I think there's a million of these tools we could talk about. Certainly that's useful. I know Jeff taught me chopsticks for putting your hands in the sewing field. If you have to hold down a piece of applique on a sample or something, holding it down with a chopstick is better than running your finger through it. Jeff said that to me, and I hadn't done that before. Mostly I've taped things down or something if I have to. And honestly, This is something, since we have some of these confessionals going through, I'll start with my confessional. I'm Eric, and I put my hand in the sewing field when I'm not supposed to because I started out on machines that had no detection for that stuff. So yeah, I absolutely have put my hand in the sewing field when I shouldn't all the time. So no, I'm not going to say I don't do that, but I love this other one too. Jeff says, raises his hand. Hi, my name's Jeff, and I've melted a hat. If you have not melted a hat messing on 3D foam, I'd be surprised. But yeah, for sure. And by the way, I love this, Brian. Hi, Jeff. You've taken your first step to recovery. I wonder if my heat iron for modern airplane file will do the job. You know what I will say? Small irons, small tacking irons are awesome too. If you don't know a tacking iron, little small iron, it has a little handle and a tiny head on it with a variable temperature right at the top for tacking down applique. It's a classic use and it's supposed to be used for applique, but I'm always surprised when people don't know what they are. I've known quite a few people who don't know these, and so that's pretty awesome. But a couple more comments before I get into the stuff that I'm actually going to cover out of my listing, but we got some pretty good stuff here too. Let's see here. Yeah, 3D heat gun for 3D foam. Yep, totally. Yeah, 650 hats, that can suck. I would say if you're having constant issues with the 3D foam, check out, try some different foams and see which ones rip cleaner. Watch your files and see if there's things you can adjust the file for sure, especially if they have little bits of foam. I talked about having a knitting needle or something to poke in little bits of foam. If there's a little bit of foam poking out of a design all the time in the same place, that's a file issue, not a foam issue. Figure out the things in your file you can do to do more cutting or capping in that area. So that's good things to say. John Dinan says the best heat gun I found is one from Harbor Freight, Bauer brand, red, and you get the warranty. They fail within 12 months, so the warranty makes it good for the replacement. Yeah, for sure. So it's one of those things too. And by the way, I like this too because I'm thinking about this myself in the future. Jeff says, if we want to get away from embroidery, my number 2 money generator is the laser. Yeah, laser's another one I've seen people use to expand their shops because they do laser cutting and engraving, and they end up being able to do more hard goods and promotional products outside of embroidery, as well as using the laser for applique. And actually, you can do things with marking garments with laser too. If you haven't seen laser embossed or debossed fleece, polar fleece, stuff like that can be debossed with a laser. I've seen denim essentially printed with a laser by zapping the pigment, but that's a specialty kind of thing. That's not what everybody's doing with lasers, but it is things. There are things to be done there. And Gary, of course, says Peggy Stitch eraser. I've had bad luck with those, so I'll admit I'm a razor blade person. But I also say that I try not to cut stitches out unless I absolutely have to. Unless something is an heirloom or I really can't replace it in time, most of the time I'm going to replace a garment instead of cutting out stitches. But that's also, mass numbers, corporate accounts. So that's one of those things. All right, so let's go ahead and say that I think that's mostly what we're going to go through today. I want to talk about expanding things too, but I'm going to get a little further afield and talk about what like I said, I called it embroidery adjacent tools and things like that. As you guys know, I always put the links list up. The links list is a mess this week. I'm going to tell you, yes, here is where the links list is. It's the first comment on any of these videos that you go see. But this links list is full of stuff, and part of it I'm going to have to explain to you. So you're going to find on their software products, you're going to find on their books that I like, tools that I like, a smattering of articles, things like that. So be prepared if you delve into the links list that you're going to find a bunch of stuff in there because I'm all over the board with what I wanted to talk about this week. But the links list is up there. It's good for you. And let's go ahead and share my second screen here. I'm going to add that to the stream so you can see. Like I said, the links list has a mess of stuff on it. Once again, you can't preview all of them with the links list object that we have here. But there's a lot of stuff that I may or may not be able to get to all of that will be interesting to you, hopefully. So if you want to go back and check it out, that's a good thing to check out. And also, because some of what people ask me about kind of universally comes down to setting up workstations, because when people say, hey, what do you use? Invariably, it starts out with software, and you guys know I'm working at Brilliance. And so what I'm working with all the time is, of course, Stitch Artist when I'm digitizing. So that's what I'm using. I've used lots of softwares over the years, but when you see me setting up, of course, that's what I'm using because that's what we're working on. But the other thing I want to say is it invariably gets to this point of discussing like what kind of tools do you use? How do you actually set up your workstation, stuff like that? This article really covers it. It's not something I was necessarily going to get into, But the digitizing basics is there, but then setting up your workstation, it's really just talks about some of the issues with setting up your station and what you need at your workstation. What I will bring up is that if you have problems with RSI, which I know I do and have some issues in general, repetitive stress injuries, it's good to move away from just using one kind of mouse. The usual mouse I actually use is a little wireless mouse. I often do this because they're easy to use. However, what I'm going to say is some of these are very heavy, especially if the battery load's pretty heavy, and I find that I get less fatigue if I use a wired mouse. Sometimes a wired gaming mouse that you can adjust the weight, you can have a lighter mouse, and I find that sometimes can help. The other thing you can do for that is vertical mice. Now, I've talked about ergonomics on this show before, but a vertical mouse, you can see this, I'll just show it to you in real time here. You put your hand on it like this, and it leaves you in kind of that hand-shaking position that's vertical instead of horizontal, which means you don't rotate the two bones in your arm and have pinch points and stuff in your wrist. And it does help you to have less difficulty with that. So I think that's something to show people for sure. The other thing is, of course, using a drawing tablet, as you saw in that article. Do definitely use drawing tablets more now than I used to, because this is something that in the Brilliance offices, people are more used to doing that. But one of the things I'm going to tell you about tablet drawing, you can see in this little picture over here that I'm wearing a palm rejection glove. I really like to wear a drawing glove, even if the tablet that you're using to draw on, if you are drawing on a tablet display, a lot of them you can turn off your palm or turn off the touch sensitivity on these if they do have touch sensitivity, or if you're using something like an iPad, whatever. And some of them will have palm rejection where they notice a big slab of palm is not the pen point. I still think it's really useful for the ability to slide your hand on, especially if you rest your hand heavily on the surface. Get a little glove. There's tons of, if you look up drawing glove, you'll see them everywhere. They're just a little like kind of light neoprene-like material or lycra-like material, depending on what kind you get, that goes over your two fingers here and goes over your palm and your wrist so that you don't have issues with drawing and your hand doesn't stick or what have you. And also where generally some of the touchscreens are so sensitive they can still pick you up through it. Otherwise, sometimes you can leave your touch on if you're someone like me who sometimes has to go back and forth to a keyboard on screen or to some other on-screen controls that would be easier to use through the touch metaphor on the tablet. You can still be able to use your hands with it a little bit and still use the pen. So that's something I would say is worthwhile. Certainly, it's not perfect all the time, and also the ergonomic mouse, I actually will use this for non-digitizing work mostly when I do, because I have found that I actually use mice in a weird way that I didn't know was weird. It is not, I don't hold the whole mouse and put my hand down on it. I actually hold the mouse just with my fingers. I can try and bring it back. I hold it with the fingers in the back, and I do micro movements with just my fingers, not my wrist or my arm. And so I actually have learned this so deeply, my muscle memory is so deeply tied to it, that I have a really hard time with the ergonomic mouse, because you can't really do that very, very readily. It's not easy to just hold with those two fingers. And so I end up like those big clumsy movements don't feel right to me when I digitize. But what I'll say is you can still do yourself some harm reduction by using it for other tasks, because a lot of what we do in a day is communications. If we're digitizers, we're talking to people. We're talking to people, we're communicating, we're doing marketing, we're on social media, we're teaching, we're learning, we're doing bookkeeping, whatever it is, if we're in business. And if not, let's just say this is something we're doing privately. Still, if we're doing our email for the day, if we're browsing the web, whatever we're doing, using things like ergonomic mice, if it gets bad enough, things like foot pedals, other aids for scrolling so that we're not constantly working that middle finger while we're scrolling on the scroll wheel, can help you to at least reduce some harm. So I think that's something pretty good. And that's what I like. So it's one of those things. Anyway, so let's go ahead and grab a couple more comments here and say, Jeff says, I have to get those the ergonomic things because of all the stress in my hands. Wish they made more ergonomic gaming mice. Yeah, I think so. So a lot of the ergonomic mice I've used are also not very precise and not very well balanced, despite the fact that they're made for ergonomic purposes. Yeah, they're not the best. And I end up actually using gaming mice and stuff too, if I'm using a wired mouse. But honestly, cheap gaming mouse is still pretty good. A lot of the sensors now are so good that I don't find that a cheap gaming mouse or there's middle of the road gaming mice that are still really quite good, I think, for digitizing. Justin says, tried one of those for digitizing, couldn't do it. Yeah, I can't digitize with the ergonomic myself either. And I even have written it in articles, despite the fact that it's mildly controversial to say that. I save my hands for digitizing is what I do now. When I'm doing something that's not digitizing, then I'll try to use other methods mostly. Virginia says, what about a rollerball mouse? I'm going to assume you mean like a trackball mouse. I just can't stand them. I don't know. I'm not a big fan. The one thing I will say about using them, I had a really great artist that I worked with for years, and he used a large trackball mouse. I mean, looked like a Centipede arcade machine for all of you rather old folks out there. I also played a lot of retro games, so you'll have to pardon me on that. But like, looked like an arcade machine trackball, huge. And he did all of his vector design work entirely with that mouse, and I was shocked because I couldn't stand it. What I'm going to say, though, is very much like what I say about mice versus using pen tablets. When you stop moving the ball on a trackball mouse, it stops moving. There's no weight, there's no impetus, and it's not tilting. You can let it sit where it's at, and the cursor sits where it's at. It doesn't take off on you. Whereas even a mouse, if you bump it, you get a little movement. If you're doing precise movements for something, or you're doing really geometric work where you keep lining stuff up, sometimes that can be really useful. And I'll say, certainly, Jeff says, what about the thumb rollerball mouse works well? And I've seen that too. I find the thumbs easier to use than the big trackballs for sure. One of those things I'll say. And actually, I'm with you, Jeff. I have dry eye problems as well. And Brian knows this. He says, I still move my face close to the screen rather than zoom in. I use blue light glasses to help my eyes from drying out too much. Now, I zoom like crazy. I'm a big zoomer, but I also use blue light glasses, and I use an eye trainer. And this is actually something that I wasn't going to share today, but I might as well. There's an open source, and I'm trying to actually pull this up for you guys. There's an open source app called ileo.com, and I'm going to go ahead and show it. It's goofy. I've gotten teased for it before because it brings up a little weird leopard that tells you to rest your eyes. And something that I don't always have on when I should. I'm actually starting back in because I've been having some more dry eye problems myself. This will make you do the 20-20-20 rule. And what that is every 20 minutes, you should look at something at least 20 feet away. I like to focus on infinity. Look outside at the sky if you can. And you should do that for at least 20 seconds every 20 minutes. And honestly, you should probably do it for a little bit more. That's good for eye strain, and also you need to blink. And I know it sounds funny, but if you're in normal conversation, you're doing normal things, your blink rate is something, I believe, if I remember this number correctly, and I may be entirely wrong on this, I believe your blink rate is somewhere around like 40 times a minute, I believe, this might not be correct. And they were saying that when you're focusing in, I just heard this from an eye doctor, where it's like 4. It's like a 10x reduction or something when you are focusing in on something or drawing or really looking at it. So that is one of those things, yeah. But yeah, this is absolutely true. This happened to me once. Halfway through a seminar, the little leopard jumped on the screen and told me it was a time for a break with my eyes. Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and give one more comment here, since we're talking about mice and stuff, and I think that's useful to talk about. We have a great one from Brian here. I got used to the cue ball trackball in the 80s. That's the kind of thing I was talking about for my art director. Can't get good results on the thumb ball. Some people can do it. Recently switched from Microsoft to a Logitech MX Anywhere. Works really great on glass, and my hand is more relaxed. Yeah, great. So that's another great recommendation. Like I said, I use a lot of Logitech mice. I actually use a small mice, despite having gigantic hands with really long fingers. I still use a small mouse because of that weird way I manipulate the mouse that I found is apparently not normal. But hey, if I did anything normally, I wouldn't be Eric, right? So let's. I just third person myself. I hate that, but whatever. I will say that if you do things your own way, sometimes you get into situations where it's hard to adapt. I will recommend that you do some things to try and take care of yourself and your eyes and your hands, because it's worthwhile. But let's talk a little bit about these embroidery adjacent tools. These tools that I think are important and interesting and worthwhile to us. And here's one of the things. One of the skills that I think is super useful for everybody is analysis. We've talked about this many times. We talked about file analysis, where we discuss, let's say we have a great file that we want to replicate as digitizers. We want to learn how a fill is made. Well, we're going to measure the angle of the fill. We're going to measure the length of the stitches. We're going to measure the density. We're going to look at our underlay, stuff like that. And that's great. The thing is, what have I also said all the time on this show, and we always try and bring it home to everybody, is that the produce of digitizing is never the file. The produce of digitizing is the embroidery. So part of analysis, part of everything we need to do with analysis, has to be analyzing actual material to look at real embroidery and make something of it. And one of the things I think that's important to think about is, how do we do that the best way? People will say sometimes that I take it a little too far, but part of it, I do a lot of measuring. And as part of that is looking at things very closely. And so one of the things that I think is a weird adjacent embroidery tool that not everybody loves or uses is a jeweler's loop or a magnifier. I actually have one listed, and actually I got a nice one that Brian actually just gifted me, which I really appreciate because it's an LED lit one, which is really cool. And I'll actually just bring it up and show it to you. The thing is that this is actually in the links list if you want to see it. This one's from iGaging, and it has a set of measuring like gels for you to actually be able to measure things in magnification as well that are included, so you can actually look at this and get some measurements and angles and sizes as well. But you wouldn't think a loop or a magnifier would be something you want to use for embroidery, but I'm going to show you a couple things that have made it useful for me and why I used to really love having one. Number one, if you have one that has the ability to magnify like this, or if you are bloody minded enough like I am to put a measuring tool onto a surface and put a loop right on top of it and try and get those things to focus up decently, you can start to get real measurements like density measurements, or make it easier to get measurements like stitch length from an actual embroidered piece. So you can do the same kind of analysis you would do in an embroidery file, but you can do it from an actual embroidered piece. And I think that's incredibly useful. And I think what I'd like to do is show you just a couple of images to show you why I think this stuff can be useful and isn't just me being crazy about embroidery. I mean, yes, it is, but not just. So let's talk about this. Number one, when I told people about the fact that they have issues with needle deflection inside of a cap crown, and they're like, no, the plastic, the buckram, it doesn't do anything. And I actually took some images through a jeweler's loop of some of the tightest stuff I have. And also, by the way, I now have a USB microscope that I do this with as well. USB microscope can be very useful for that too, and they're also not that expensive. But I like to have a jeweler's loop so I can look at stuff, number one, on the go without apps or without something else, and because you can look at it with your eyes and actually get a good look at it. But this one was a jeweler's loop and a digital camera. So this is quite a ways back. If you look at this buckram, what you can see at this particular buckram actually has these vertical rows of this plastic that is incredibly thick. It is not like a normal woven buckram that I was used to. This cap stiffener, if you look at those little pieces, they're almost like mechanical pencil lead made of hard plastic, if you want to say it like that, little rods. And when I tried to explain it, I finally got to the customer and said, hey, this is what's inside of the cap that you brought me, because they had customer supplied caps. Every time my needle is hitting one of these little rods, even with a sharp, even with a thick needle, the two choices I have are to break through the plastic or for the needle to bend around it. And it was frequently bending around it and causing weird edge quality. So I showed that to a customer. And it also helped me figure out, is this really what's happening? Well, when we look at it, now this one is not quite as bad, but you can see that we're getting some jaggies. It's because this edge, it's grabbing on. You can see it grabbing onto each one of those little rods as it goes through. So it's not that it's always going to be the most useful thing on earth, or you're going to use it for everything you want to do. But if you're really kind of confused about how something's running or about how stitches are being used, this really can help you to get there. And you can see in a very detailed way on your sample how things are working. Like I said, it's not for everything, but I really do find it useful. And for me, getting an elemental understanding of embroidery also includes literally just looking at how the interaction between the needle and the thread and the fabric comes together. One of the other things is to show this. This is a fill, very similar problem. Somebody telling me, okay, they're getting weird edge quality, and what they bring me is a cap that has a knit, a textured knit front. And when they look at it, they're like, oh, it kind of just looks like a sports shirt. It's really not much texture. I don't know why it's giving me all this trouble. And when I look at it, I'm like, no, it looks very rough. When you zoom in on it, when you look at it through the jeweler's loop, when you look at it through a magnifier, you can actually see that roughness is from the satin stitch splitting on these rows. You can actually see that those jagged sides, the little edges that they're talking about, well, this is interaction between the knit and the piece. Now, I'm going to tell you, I will tell everybody to judge things from a handshake distance and to discuss that. However, when somebody is telling me, hey, I still don't like the quality, especially when we're talking about a customer saying they don't love the quality of the edge, part of what I can do is say, this is what's happening to you. You're selecting a cap that's going to cause a little bit of edge quality issue. Even if I use the right materials, even if I use the right settings, you're probably going to see a little bit of this edge quality issue, and here's why. And you can also see things related to the way it's constructed that might help you kind of discover, ways to deal with it. Because what we can see is we've got a pretty dense vertical rib. We've got some dents in here. We do need to treat this thing like a textured material, despite the fact that it's a cap crown. So I think that magnification is actually quite useful. That, and sometimes just looking at embroidery designs. These are incredibly small letters, very, very small. And what you can see here, part of the issue is we were having trouble where people were unhappy with it was somebody else's piece, but they had some issues with the ends of the letters and with the way the letters were forming. And what I found is the ends of the letters that we're looking at, like the N that's in the bottom, the lowercase n at the bottom, kind of center left. The thing that was causing the issue that made it look like the strokes were too long is actually a lock stitch. There's a lock stitch that's coming off of this thing and making a knot. And you can see it in a very detailed manner here. Also, I criticized the use of stitch angle here. And if you look at the top of the R, we were getting breakage and issues where there was a gap. They kept on saying there's a gap, there's a gap, there's a gap. The person who had digitized it said there's no gap, there's an overlap. But if you look at the R that's at the top center of the screen, what we're seeing is the interaction between the satin stitch and the fill stitch. The satin is pulling on the rows of the fill stitch because it's at the same angle. The edge of the satin is interacting at the same angle of the fill, which is causing that pull out. And now we can actually see that in a really close-up manner. So like I said, it's not for everything, but sometimes it can help you discuss things, and it can definitely help you teach people about things. So I think it's pretty useful. And I think that's something that I like quite a lot, is to be able to see these things. And plus for me, I just find it fascinating too. So the other part of it, I just like it. I like it. I find it fascinating. The other thing is, when I'm addressing a new piece of material, if I want to really know a lot about it, I can take that thing under a magnifier and say, hey, this is what it looks like. And I've also found that things like dealing with metallic threads, I had a kind of metallic thread that I just hated the quality that I was getting. And part of the quality I was getting from it was that the foil, the way the foil was wrapped and constructed, it would do this weird kinking and bending on the smaller satin stitches, and it looked rough. But what was really happening is the foil wasn't, like, the thread wasn't able to pull tight into the form I was asking it to do, and a different thread was able to do that. More modern types of metallic are probably great for that. And I would say that's pretty interesting to have around. And honestly, you can also achieve a lot, honestly. Good old steel ruler. I think good old steel ruler with metrics on it is a lot of what you need, because I'm not trying to get super, super tight on it. You can certainly go finer than that, and I have. But back in the day, I used to carry at first an older version. I don't have currently I'm looking to get a new digital caliper. I also used to have a caliper for measurement too. And that's something else I believe I have. I don't have it up here right now. But yeah, absolutely. It's something that I frequently had, was a caliper involved, so I could look at the width of satin stitches compared to what I had actually digitized them at. And I think that was easier to measure than using a ruler sometimes. So you'll see, and you'll actually see that I've showed this piece before, where I will literally say, okay, my borders are about this thick. I threw them at about this width in my actual design, so I'm getting this much distortion. Now, this is a really old school caliper, does not have really fine measurements, but it was the first one I've had, and honestly, you can get a finer one. Do I think you're going to use calipers on everything, or do I even think that's advisable? Absolutely not. I'm just saying that when you want to do measurements and you want to figure something out, or you're having issues, being able to get accurate measurements means you can take those measurements back into your software and deal with the correction without having quite so many questions. So let's see what other kind of comments we have from folks here. And yeah, Jeff says, I've seen Matt use a microscope. Yeah, I have one too, just recently. And I'm saying, like I said, it's not for everything, but sometimes when you're trying to understand things, definitely, I think that's useful anyway. Cindy King talking about our eye strain problems. I prefer to just close my eyes for a nap, not a bad way if you can do it. If you got the time and the ability, go ahead and do that for sure. Brian says, we measured the pull of wash away under our recent patch with a FS fill, and found that a freestanding fill, and found that when we do that stitch, we needed to automatically extend the width about 0.5 millimeters for the result. You have to measure the output and go back and adjust the input 100%. So this analysis and measurement, when we're having problems, allows us to look at what's actually happening on the machine, go back and figure it out. And so Jeff says, so cap suppliers should include some sort of edge rating numbers so us embroidery people will know which caps perform better than others. Yeah, I wish they would. I will say that it's also not entirely uniform. I've had caps from the same brand not turn out exactly the same way, with the materials being similar. So I don't know. I mean, for me, there are brands of caps I stopped offering, or at least I wouldn't. It's not that I would not offer them. It's that when someone asked me, "Hey, what kind of cap do you like?" I wasn't trying to give them that hat. And that particular hat that we had that was brought in, the crown was bulletproof. Don't get me wrong; you could sit on it and it would pop back up. It might throw you off, certainly, shoot you back off wherever you sat on. But the thing is, that cap was horrible to embroider. It really did. It bent needles, it broke needles, it deflected stitches. It was awful. You had to use a pretty heavy gauge needle, and you had to really punch that sharp through there to make it look okay. And even then, you would get a dusting of the plastic from that support material that would drag back up to the surface of the cap. And so we're over there with tape cleaning off the plastic dust that was deposited on it, because you couldn't steam it off, you couldn't vacuum it off. It was like almost attached. It was almost fused to the surface, but you could roll it off with a lint roller or a piece of tape. So yeah, what I would say is curate your collection, like I say about anything else you do. Find the pieces that work the best for you and stick with those pieces. That's really the way to go for it. I wish you had a rating. I doubt it. I don't think the cap manufacturer is going to do that. Plus, you have to talk to your clients and say, hey, handshake distance 3 feet, social distance 6 feet. What does it really look like? Is the very small amount of edge quality issue you're seeing here a problem? Or if they want a material that causes a tremendous amount of deflection, if they want something on the gauge of like a Carhartt cotton duck and they want to put tiny letters on it, it breaks up the tiny letters, it's time to tell them sometimes the choices that we make about materials provide some limitations to what we can do. Jeff says, I'm a big fan of the machinist ruler. I probably have 20 of them. I have a problem putting things down and not remember where I put them. LOL. Yeah, no, machinist rulers are great. And like I said, anything you use for measurement and viewing, I think is useful. Mostly the thing I want to say about that, the adjacent skill is analysis and measurement. And I think it's useful to understand analysis and measurement. And yes, I have done things like get a big set of oval guides, like a template guide, so I can use those to figure out curvature on letters that I have to reproduce. I have taken a protractor to a garment to get the angle off of some object that they wanted just right so I can set it in my software. I think it's useful to take a look at. It is not always going to be uniform or easy to figure out, but things like pull and push compensation, as long as we're doing the right thing with our hooping, as long as we're doing the right thing with our stabilization, are measurable. Like Brian said, we're losing that half millimeter. That half millimeter may be important to you, especially when we're talking about things like underlay poking out a place it shouldn't, a fill not hitting a border right where it should when we have a real thin border. Those measurements can be useful. And I think that's good. So let's go ahead and let's talk about some other stuff, right? Drawing. Now, I'm not going to get heavily into drawing by hand or artistic drawing. I'm going to get into vector drawing. I think vector drawing is super important, not just because vector drawing does lead us to a lot of digitizing skills and shape editing skills, but I think that certainly vector drawing is one of the things we do for preparing art. It's one of the things we can do if we need to replace or clean things up, if we need to edit or make new versions of stuff, or if we want to make our own pieces, our own art. I think vector drawing is very useful. And yes, of course, it plays into digitizing, especially if you have software like Stitch Artist where the Bezier model is fully available for creation of shapes. But understanding vector drawing also helps you with things like dealing with fonts and conversions of fonts, dealing with art that will come from people. Because honestly, you're going to be getting vector art and more as vector is more common and also used online. Vector drawing is super important. So the first thing I'm going to cover, people always ask me, what tools do you use? And I say yes. Because the truth of the matter is in my history of being a designer, being a digitizer, working on art of all sorts, including, by the way, if you didn't know, I did a ton of signed vinyl and glass applications, auto vinyl at some time. So vinyl signage, done a ton of that. Applique, done a ton of that. A fair amount of sublimation printing as well, and doing some prep work, not a super ton for screen print art as well. So in all of that time, I have used just about every vector software there is. What's the gold standard people usually refer to? Adobe Illustrator. I don't think I need to belabor the point aside from just saying Adobe Illustrator is still often seen by designers as kind of the gold standard. I don't think you need it to do vector art for that stuff, right? I don't think you necessarily need to do to have Adobe Illustrator do vector art, and especially because part of the reason people still lean on Illustrator really heavily are things like color profiles, stuff like that. If you're not doing print, and especially if you're not doing the kind of print where we're doing color matching and profile stuff like that. We're not doing paper printing. We're not doing high-end printing. If we're doing screen print where we're mixing our own inks, if we're doing something where the color is not that important, I think that vector is the most important thing about vector is the ease of use of the tool and frankly the availability of the tool. So what you will often see people do, especially ever since Adobe went to the subscription model, it makes them quite expensive to run, is to use CorelDRAW. CorelDRAW is really very common in screen printing and embroidery, and especially because Corel is integrated with some softwares for embroidery as well. What I will honestly say is, despite the fact that I have used softwares throughout their entire time being integrated with CorelDRAW, I find the integration to be frankly distracting and kind of poor. Even with the integration there, I often will do vector work outside of the software and bring it in once I'm finished, rather than go back and forth between the embroidery model and the vector model. And in fact, what I'll say is, like if you have software like Stitch Artist where it has a vector model built in, if you need to do work on vector, you do work on the vector with the Bezier tools that are there. And if you're doing something that is more art creation that maybe has nothing to do with embroidery, or those shapes have nothing to do with embroidery, I like to go out all the way into the graphic software no matter what. So CorelDRAW is great. I maintain a current copy of CorelDRAW, and I will go ahead and say, if you haven't done any training for CorelDRAW, if you need help learning it, CorelTrainer.com, that is Clay Barbera. He's a cool person who's been at all the DAX shows. So if you go to DAXshow.com, he's actually doing a piece next week on CorelDRAW, and he's done some online classes on CorelDRAW. So when everybody asks me about this, how do you learn CorelDRAW? Well, you can always learn from a professional like Clay, who's in the garment industry, the decoration industry. And his links are in the links list, by the way, since I've kind of glazed over those. But CorelDRAW is a great piece, but once again, still fairly expensive. They have also started to go toward the subscription model. You can still buy the upgrades. I buy the upgrades so that if I ever stop the subscription, I will still have the last version of Corel that I used. However, more and more and more, I have moved most of my work into Affinity. And this is Affinity. They just did their 1.9 updates, which they're doing here, but they actually have multiple products, and I use Affinity products for both my vector drawing and my photo editing. I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. But Affinity is really quite inexpensive. And actually right now, especially because of what's going on in the world, they have taken their already fairly ludicrous prices, which are about $50 for each of these suites, or each of these pieces in the suite, and they're now about 25 bucks. So don't get me wrong. Love the things like that they're going on in open source. Inkscape is great and what have you. I will say, if you want a little bit more fit and polish, if you want it to be more like an Illustrator-like experience, more like a Corel experience, and really it's Illustrator. It's aiming for Illustrator. If you want an Illustrator-like experience, but you don't want to spend the Illustrator money or be attached to it, then especially for embroiderers, where mostly we're taking those shapes and then doing something else to it, we're taking that art and working on it for embroidery, so we don't have to do the kind of publication and print pre-processing that you would do if you're in paper printing necessarily. I absolutely would recommend looking at Affinity. And like I said, it has more than just Designer. Affinity Designer is the vector tool. I actually have it up here, and I'll show you these in a minute. But Affinity Designer is there. There's also Affinity Photo. So if you need a Photoshop-like tool, which you do, you need to be able to do photo editing for multiple things that I'll discuss. But yeah, that's really good. We have Affinity Photo. I use this all the time. In fact, all of the preview graphics you're seeing for the Takeup, for stuff I do for Brilliance, any of the graphics I do helping for designing the website stuff, the stuff for the blog, a lot of that is stuff that I've put together. That's all done in Affinity Photo generally. So Affinity Photo, Affinity Designer, very useful. And right now, if you wanted to, $50, you'd have them both out the door. Hard to complain. Plus, they do have a publisher. So they have a publisher version, so for desktop publishing type stuff and mockups. I think it's pretty awesome. It's not, like I said, it is not Illustrator. It's not really even Corel. There are things that it does lack, but most of this stuff is really useful, and I do like that too. And I think that licensing is a soft spot for me. I don't love the way some of this licensing has been done, and certainly when we're talking about our garment decorators, having to constantly manage the license is a little rough. But it is pretty nice. I do like it very much. So we'll just say Affinity. Really have enjoyed it. I've been using it on and off, and I will say that I have a large stock of Adobe Illustrator files from when I was using it consistently. And so far, aside from some of the features that they don't duplicate, Affinity has been able to open those files as well. So I've been able to access my old Illustrator files, my old Photoshop files as well. So that is pretty useful. I just thought I would, mention it and say, not too bad, not too bad. And that's something that is super useful and that I think is worth knowing about. So Affinity, let's go ahead and actually bring up a couple of the things, because here is Affinity, and like I said, it is a very Illustrator-like experience. This is a piece that I was working on. It's a sketch that I've done that I'm now doing the shape building process on. And you can see it's very much like Illustrator. The models and the modes are very much that way. But what I will say is they are just now getting some of the tools you really need, like contouring and stuff like that. They were kind of lacking. They're definitely in the realm now of being useful. And I would say that the experience is a little bit better than Inkscape for me. But, something really cool that I think is worth looking at. And also for Photoshop, here's the other thing I want to talk about, right? Yes, we have drawing, and drawing is important. I'm going to get back to drawing in just a second. Image editing is important for doing things like mock-ups and marketing. But let's go back to vector drawing for just a second. Yes, Affinity is pretty great. I will say there is one person I absolutely have to give a shout out to, and this is also where I have a nice little offer for you guys that doesn't make me any money, might make somebody else money, but it does certainly save you a bunch of money if you want to do it. People ask me regularly kind of where I learned to do vector. I'll admit, first vector I just learned on my own. I hit my head against the wall until I got vector. I just learned how to do it. And this was largely because I had to do things like not only working for digitizing, the original digitizing software I had, you absolutely had to make all your art first and bring in your bitmap art once it was done. So any new creation I had to make, especially typesetting, I needed to use some sort of vector software to do that. And that's where I learned both Corel way back in the Corel 10 days, and I learned Illustrator once I went to a shop that had Illustrator. However, how I got better at vector and started to make very, very clean vector is through learning from a guy named Von Glitchka. And I'm not a big person who goes to trainers. I tend to start by hitting my head against the wall, like I said, and just doing something until I figure it out. But Von, I think, was probably my introduction to doing, I would say, vector very cleanly and well. He's an awesome designer who does a lot of teaching. And I think it is absolutely useful to be able to learn how to use vector in a clean manner. And the cool thing was last night while I was working, I was listening to Von Glitchka's piece he did with a user group, an Illustrator user group. Now, Von's teaching is really Illustrator specific. I will admit that. However, his teaching on using the Bezier curve really is not. That stuff really is not Illustrator specific. It is about how vector and Bezier curves work. If you don't know Bezier curve, that's the pulling with the handles. I mean, some people, I know you guys probably all know Bezier curves, but I'm talking about the pen tool where you have handles and curves that you're using generally is done the Bezier curve. His teaching on that absolutely is more universal, and I think that you can do a whole lot worse than look at Von Glitchka's stuff. And let me try and grab stuff. I've got so many tabs open right now for the stuff I wanted to teach you guys that I think I've lost Von's tab. Let me go ahead and pop this open because I do have his products here. This is the thing I wanted to show you guys, that I attending that piece, he actually has a bunch of things, including his Vector Basic Training Book, which I learned from version 1 of the Vector Basic Training Book, as well as his lynda.com classes, which are now LinkedIn Learning classes that luckily, it turns out in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at least, our library system lets you have LinkedIn Learning access for free. So his classes there have been really incredible. But Vector Basic Training is an awesome book. And he made his own PDF edition when it turned out that Amazon's publishing arm kind of did a bad job with it. So he made a PDF edition that's now the canonical edition. And you can see it here at glitchkastudios.com. That is in the links. And it talks about, and there's a bunch of video. It's like 7 hours of HD video that comes with the purchasing of the PDF version. But the product here usually costs quite a bit more. It costs like $25. I actually have a much lower option because he was doing that user group thing, and I asked him, hey, can I share with my people your link for that? Can I share with them the book deal? And there's actually a book deal there. You can see it's bit.ly/VBT2 book deal. It's the third link down. And the cool thing is, Von is letting us have his Vector Basic Trading Book for $12. Used to be much more. Used to be $24, $25. And for $12, it's a PDF version of his Vector Basic Training Book, which I can't recommend enough. So if you guys check that out, it's in the links list. It's something that I did at the last minute. I literally, in another tab that I just closed, is a discussion with me and Von trying to figure out if it was okay for me to share this link he did with a private user group that he did this group thing with. But Von is really awesome, teaches some stuff. If you have an incredibly hard time getting your head around drawing in Vector, this is a very nice way to do it. So I would say, worthwhile to check out Vector Basic Training. And if you like that, and if you want to use it after you check out his first process video, go ahead and jump over there and take a look at that, because for $12, it's hard to beat for learning Vector. I think that it's very worthwhile. So let's go ahead and get some more comments, and we'll see what's going on here. So let's see here. We have first Brian, which I absolutely agree with this. I use calipers all the time with a magnifier, of course. Yeah, calipers are fantastic for measurement. And Jeff says, I didn't know you did sign vinyl. Yeah, lots of sign vinyl. A lot of the shops that I was in originally, I did all the signage for the interior signage for the shop itself, and then we did a lot of window vinyl stuff like that, and transfers. So window transfers, windshield, car window transfers, stuff like that. And believe it or not, this weird embroidery guy has managed to put vinyl on a bunch of police cars and SWAT vehicles in my time. So there you go. Am I professional at it? No, I do not belong in the car wrap competition at the NBM shows. However, I can put vinyl where I have to, when I have to. Jeff says, I use Corel and Affinity. I prefer Affinity, but Corel is integrated with some software. Yep, absolutely. Cindy, hey, I'm trying not to these days, but I agree with you. One very important item in the embroidery room is candy. Well, you got to get by how you get by, people. Jeff says subscription model is evil. And I'll say this, Brian has a good comment. And this is about us and Brilliance. I work at Brilliance, so you know that we really have a strong feeling about this. Corel made me mad at their licensing, and I'm on Affinity now, says Brian. And here's the other thing, shameless plug, and I'll agree with this. Within Brilliant Software, we put our money where our mouth is. The products are licensed to use on as many computers as you own. No activation, no dongles. Mac and Windows versions are included for one price. That is why that is the way it is, and Brian's been very generous with that. So what I love about that is actually another thing. Not only that we don't charge for all the updates and stuff like that, and I don't want this to be just a big and Brilliance ad, but this is the thing that I really love. Two different things. Number one, Brian has let me outfit schools before, which was awesome. I've been able to help schools get outfit with software so that they can learn. Number two, the way the licensing works, if someone has to work on a machine and learn at home or have their person learn at home, we've allowed them to do that before. And I think that's lovely, because the education is what we're about. We want to make more digitizers and more embroiderers, and we want to make more people who believe in this medium and make great things happen. And Brilliance is putting their money where their mouth is, and I love that. So, and honestly, why I support the Affinity people too, they are continuing to improve their product at a price point that's reasonable. And another thing about Affinity, very much like in Brilliance, right? In Brilliance, we have a user community that's nice and is very supportive. So you get not only our official support, which is awesome, and all the help guides and everything else, but you get a community that's engaged with it. Well, the cool thing about Affinity these days, because of what happened with Adobe and Corel, a lot of garment decorators, especially small garment decorators for whom the art software is a necessity, but not everything they do, have switched to Affinity. And now, if you go check out the offerings at DAX, so daxshow.com, you're going to see people like Dane Clement, pretty big in the industry for art. Dane's design work is huge, and he's out there teaching Affinity. It's being noticed. So it's being noticed, and it's something to look for. So yeah, it's one of those things, folks. Very well worth that, I think. So that's something to look at. Like I said, I'm not saying that there aren't other softwares out there. There are. Softwares do good work. And like I've always said, I've seen every embroidery software, including ones that I think are terrible, put out a masterpiece if the person behind it understood embroidery well and was willing to spend the time. It is much nicer to have a software like ours that does what you want it to do when you want it to do it. But like I said, it doesn't stop you from doing good embroidery no matter what you are. But what I will say is I am very proud to be with a software that I don't think is predatory. I think that's the thing. And like the stuff from Adobe, love their work, understand that it's great, used it for years, still prefer some stuff about it. Love Corel, kept it the entire time I was using Adobe for everything, because I really enjoy especially some of the way that text works in Corel. But I don't love kind of how people are over the barrel with their subscriptions sometimes, because it really is a difficulty at points. And I've had a lot of trouble with compatibility because of that, because they're doing weird things to get backwards compatibility on files to be weird. And I don't love that. I don't love that locking up. So without being on the soapbox too long, it's why I do love the way Brian has our licensing done. And because we are there to support the education and the use of the software. If people don't use the software, we're not happy. So that's what we're looking for. I love real users, folks, real software users, real digitizers. So we'll get on beyond that. There's a couple other comments too that people are talking about that I'd love to bring out. First, Mary says, thank you for uh, recommended Affinity. Got it about 2 months ago. Yeah, Affinity is awesome. It has been useful for me, at least. Like I said, I still probably keep my CorelDRAW software for sure, but Affinity has been very useful. And if you're just getting into vector software and want to learn, want to have a copy, it's very useful. Jess says, what do you use for video editing? And Brian does a lot of the stuff that we have right now. And I have done video editing previously, but I'll step out and say, because Letty says I use Camtasia and Brian uses Camtasia as well. I've used it a little bit and it's great. And it's something I plan to use myself in the future more. I'll be honest with you. I had a lot of open source stuff I was using recently. The kind of stuff I was using was causing a lot of crashes and difficulty. And I think I'm going to look for a more professional product. And it looks like Camtasia may be the way to go for that one. So that's one of those things for sure. So it's like I said, there's no reason to say don't keep your multiple softwares or use whatever software you like, but I do like to say there are softwares that are looking out for you, and I do like that there are options. And especially for embroiderers, a lot of us, if we are embroiderers only, we're not going to be using that art for anything but as a basis for more embroidery work, or maybe to help us produce cut files, things like that. I do think we should have print capable work, but even with sublimation, stuff like that, if you were using color chart, which I love doing, is printing a color chip chart on the actual material we're going to use and then selecting our colors from that color chip chart so we use the right settings and we are on the right materials, then the color management is a little less important because we're actually going to be working in the material. Once again, our produce is the material, not the file. So it does make me change a little bit about that. So guys, I haven't gotten into hardly half of what the stuff I want to talk about, guys. So I'm going to talk about a few more things for sure. And some of these are just fun things, right? So image editing, certainly I already talked a little about Affinity. The one thing I'll say is everybody says, well, why I'm not going to need to learn Photoshop for stuff. I just cleaned some stuff up. I think that the big user case for me to learn image editing has been mockups, certainly. And you'll see that this mockup looks terrible because it's done the way some mockup engines do the mockups, which is just to slap a flat image on things. I have found sometimes that I really want to be able to do my own mesh warping, and I find that having a real capable photo editor lets me be able to do the mesh warping and to get the actual centers. Now I just did a poor job there, but as I'm doing this remotely through the wrong window, my streaming window, it's not exactly updating very fast. What I'll say is I have been able to make much better mockups because I've done image editing than when I've relied on mockup tools. Now, there are many more mockup tools online than there used to be, but I find the ability to do light image editing super important. And let's say we have things like loose stray threads. Now, we don't have it here, but let's say we take an example of one of our pieces that we love, but we had a trim on it or a piece of thread we didn't see when we were in the photo booth or when we were taking pictures of it in our shop, and we're trying to show it to a customer, but the thread looks horrible. It's pretty easy for us, if we know a little bit of Photoshop, to grab something like our image stamp tool, grab a sample, and even though I'm cheating here, let's grab the image that's here, and I'm going to paint out the line of thread here. Let's say that was actually a bit of stitching we didn't want in our sample for our e-commerce project. That was super easy and fast, and I like to call it digital trimming. If you have some stitches that run afoul when you're doing a photo shoot, rather than set up an entire photo shoot a second time, being able to grab a clone brush, and like I said, I'm doing a rough job of it here, grabbing a clone brush and pasting something out, using a healing brush. There's also the automatic healing brush tool. Sometimes those make some weird artifacts, so I often just clone. But you can then say remove, like I said, remove some stitches if something goes wrong, but you don't want to waste an entire photo shoot that you've done if the piece already looks good. So healing brush, like I said, makes it look a little muddy. I find that sometimes is more visible, but these are the kind of things that I think are useful, as well as doing things like compositing. Whenever I make my goofy little take-up video portion here, I do my thumbnailing, all these little layers and everything that are in here, this is all done in Affinity Photo, and as you can see, all the little goofy bits and the book covers and font managers and all the stuff that I put in here, that's all done in Affinity Photo. I think it's worthwhile to learn how to manage this stuff, how to be able to take level adjustments on and off, how to understand to handle colors and layering, stuff like that. It's not that you have to be the best at everything, but I do think it's worthwhile to be able to do some amount of this work. And certainly, I think it's worthwhile to have software to do a little bit of it. So image editing is useful for e-commerce, for sending out, like I said, if you have to have really nice mock-ups, sometimes the mock-up is hard to get just right when we're dealing with customers, or we may have to erase the background off of something or change something quickly. And sometimes being able to do that in Photoshop or in, like I said, Affinity Photo is pretty useful. So I think that's something to learn. It's something to look at classes for. It's worthwhile to know that stuff, especially, like I said, being able to do a quick mesh warp on a logo so that it actually follows a cap that's in a 3/4 version, especially if you can only find this version of the cap image and you don't have the cap on hand or don't have time to do the photography yourself. You might be able to do like I've done here and run an actual embroidered sample on Stabilizer or on a piece of material, and then you'll take the photo, make a PNG file of it, and do some editing and throwing that together. Is that something you learn overnight? Not necessarily, but it's not super difficult. And if you're going to be doing tons of work like that, or if you're going to be putting things together for newsletters, stuff like that, sometimes it's useful to be able to make a cleaner image or to clean up an image. The other thing certainly that's useful about having something like that is being able to do color adjustments, contrast adjustments, sharpening, things that you would do to an image when you have a poor quality image before digitizing. I consider image editing to be part of that process too. Sometimes you have a piece of art that's a little rough, but not terrible. You can turn up the contrast and it might help you to see edges on text, edges on detailed items, might be able to clear some things up to make it easier for you to handle. So certainly I think that's useful, and I like that for sure. So, I think that's useful. I think that is something that you can, I think you can turn it into a lot. Let's put it this way. Being able to do some Photoshop work, light Photoshop work, means that we can use catalog photos and sometimes do some recoloring of images if we have to. We can composite different things together. We can do mock-ups. We can make catalog covers for custom catalogs. And even if we're just doing embroidery, Photoshop work lets us grab and erase things and do work to art. So let's say we have some art that just has some busy background behind it, or it just needs a little cleanup, or we have some text we don't want and we just want it out of the way. Literally being able to bring it into a photo editor and do some erasing, stuff like that is useful. But certainly mock-ups are the big thing, mock-ups and preparing images for embroidery. So I think that's super useful. I like that very much, and I think that's a very useful thing to be able to do. So having that software is there and having that skill is important. And like I said, I am now seeing people teach Affinity Photo in in larger places, in trade shows, which you hadn't seen before. So you can actually get it Affinity Photo and not have to be spending a tremendous amount of money to do so. So I think that's something that's worthwhile looking at. And like I said, do I have Illustrator and everything else? There's an old CorelDRAW file I have open, and it's actually from an email forum that I belong to. Yes, I do. These things are still useful to me. In fact, the reason I'm going to show you this is something fun also that's in the links list. There is an old school piece of open source software that I love called Uniconverter. And the only thing I'm going to tell you about that is you can use it to import DST files, so Tajima files, and kick out vector that is literally just straight line representation of the stitches themselves. And I've used that with my own custom brush packs that I made, and made a vector embroidery preview. That's a little out there, but if you find the link for Uniconverter in there, it's an old school thing that was made for converting different vector images back and forth between each other. The thing that it does do, though, is kick out a fairly decent SVG file that is just literally the stitch lines between each coordinate point in a DST file, and you can do a lot of stupid art tricks with it, which is how I made this. That was done with vector brushes that I created, and that DST file. So this was a digitized piece that became a vector version of embroidery. So that was, once again, stupid embroidery art tricks. Nothing you need to do, but fun anyway. So Uniconverter is in there, and that's pretty fun too. But yeah, I think that certainly we can use other methods for that. I think even if you use other methods for doing things like the photoshopping, like the mockups, certainly Printful. There's a bunch of, like I said, there are so many mockup tools right now that I almost don't need to mention them. And a lot of the corporate catalogs will have like Zoom built into them, Zoom catalogs, and they have mockups that are okay. Not all of them are three-dimensional, but sometimes you'll find that you have a garment for which there is no mockup, for which they don't have it in their engine, or you have an issue with the way it's coming out. And if you have an issue with the way the engine works or the sizing works and you want to do more work on it, being able to do it manually is great. And I think it's just a tool you should have anyway. I think you should be able to do this kind of editing. If you don't have this kind of tool, then you probably should. But let me go ahead and grab a couple of comments real quick here before we go on to the next portion. And we'll see how we have some of this. We've got a couple of people who are talking about software. So thank you, Brian, for handling the software questions that we have there for sure. So good stuff there. But yeah, Justin says, photo editing makes great embroidery, perfect embroidery. I'm not going to say I've never edited some embroidery. Usually I don't when I'm trying to show my work. A lot of it is not. What I will say is this. I live in a house with cats. My wife loves cats very much, and I love the little cats we have now. We get cat hair on embroidery. We get trims on embroidery. We get little pieces of lint on the embroidery, even if I'm not messing around with the embroidery itself, which I try not to do. Sometimes I have some cat hair on a piece. I don't want to reshoot a piece for a magazine because I have a cat hair across it. So pretty frequently I'll paint the cat hair out. So that's the truth. By the way, I am not done still, Elizabeth. I'm still here. But yeah, can I still get the Affinity software in the Vector PDF book? The Affinity software has nothing to do with me. The deal is going on from Affinity. I actually did not put that deal together. So if you go to find the Affinity software, they're doing the deal, and that's fine. The Vector PDF book, absolutely. It's still live. You won't get an immediate download. Vaughn is actually approving all of these because he's doing it for half of his usual price. However, yes, that link should still work. If you go to the links list, you'll find that VBT2 deal link. And you can see right above it is the link to show you what's in that Vector book. And it is a really great book. Like I said, a lot of it's going to be Illustrator specific. So don't think that there isn't Illustrator specific stuff in it. The concepts behind shape building and drawing with your pen tool, with your Bezier tool, are great. And then definitely go look him up on LinkedIn Learning. It's worth looking if your library system has free access to lynda.com, which has now become LinkedIn Learning. You may be able to get that free. And if not, you can actually get classes through LinkedIn Learning. And his drawing with vectors is fantastic. His design courses are all fantastic. So Von Glitchka, super useful. So check those links out, and I think it's worthwhile. So I think that's something to look at. Absolutely worthwhile. And Pam says, you have more knowledge in your pinky than I can grasp in my brain. I doubt that. I think everybody here can do a lot more than you think you can. And what I will say is I do happen to be someone who does a lot of things themselves rather than hiring it out, if you say. But I would say it's not necessarily that you can't do it. It just depends on what you needed to do. You have to realize working in small businesses, as I often did, and doing all of their e-commerce work. If you guys didn't know, I've been running and building e-commerce sites for my entire career as well. You have to have mock-ups, and this was previous to the time like now where there were the mock-up tools that are out there. Now there's tons of mock-up tools. But here's the other thing I'm going to tell you guys. Not only are there great online mock-up tools that do a lot of work, now they only have the garments that they have. That's part of the problem with them. But there are PSD, which are Photoshop document mock-ups, more and more available, and you can open those in Affinity. So a lot of those do work, not all perfectly. So there's a lot of stuff that's out there. But yeah, there's a lot of apps that do great mock-ups. Do check them out. I actually have some discussion of that in one of my Images Magazine articles. But let's get on from that. We have a little bit more. I know we're into bonus time. I'm not going to go super deep into bonus time today, but let's do a few more things. Recording ideas. Very briefly, what I'm going to tell you guys is I think it is very important for us to record things as we think of them, to be able to take notes and to be able to, when we're doing these analyses and things, to take notes. I like to do a lot of by hand recording when I'm writing, and I always make sure I have something on me, especially when I'm traveling. And so I think it's worthwhile to kind of just say, hey, one of the things I do is, despite the fact that I have a phone, is always have pen and paper on me when I need to take notes. And so recording ideas, I think it's a habit that we can get into. Some people don't like to do a lot of writing, and I think sketch notes are really awesome. I actually have a link about sketch notes as well, which is where you're doing a more visual version of note taking. It's something that I at least learned from a guy named Sean West, who's really awesome. You'll hear me talk about him more than a couple times. But yeah, Sean West is really great, and he does sketch notes, super kind of interesting stuff, if you ask me. But this is his sketch note. I'm going to pop up one of his pages of sketch notes where this is how he takes notes in a regular blank book. But this is one of these ways where if you're a super visual person, you can kind of do these things that you have these visual representations of what you're thinking about when you're listening to a talk or reading a book or whatever you're doing. I think taking notes is pretty important. I often, because I have an Android phone and I use a lot of Google products, I use Google Keep. Google Keep is an easy one to use. However, we use for Brilliance, and I have used previously. Evernote is really great. I know some people are OneNote devotees. Whatever it is that you're into, I think becoming a note taker is useful. What I will say though is I generally tend to have pen and paper on me, and because this is a tools kind of post, a tools kind of video, I figure some people love this stuff. A couple of things I have: I love these little Rhodia notebooks, Rhodia, and I actually am a quadrille. I use graph paper a lot because I draw and write, and I like having that format. One of the other things I love comes from a great designer. His name is Aaron Draplin. Does this really cool, thick kind of very, I would personally consider it like 60s, 70s kind of thick line design work. He's a graphic designer, but one of the things he came up with is bringing back the old school kind of seed corn farmer's notebook, and he called it Field Notes. And here's a brick of Field Notes that I actually got when I was seeing Aaron Draplin. Funny enough, wrapped up not because it's because I'm not taking notes, but because it's actually being shipped off to a friend of mine at some point. He's moved like 3 times since I've been waiting to ship him off a box. I need to ship him off some stuff. So somebody you may know, Jamie Chalmers, Mr. X of MrXStitch.com. I'm sending him some field notes, and he doesn't know that yet. So if you're listening, Jamie, you just learned. You're getting some field notes, my man, among other things. But yeah, field notes are a really great format for a small book, and they come in lined, dot, and grid. These are really fantastic. One of the other things I really love, and it's one of the links is on there, this is a zebra pen, and you're going to say, you with your giant hands, how do you use this little teeny tiny pen? This is a telescoping zebra pen. It writes very well. It keeps well in a pocket. And the latest version of them now has a stylus on the back. So for your phone, if you use a stylus or draw on your phone or on your iPad, tablet, whatever, at least it's a little capacitive stylus on the back. So those links are all in there. I like to keep notebooks around me all the time. So you'll find a range of notebooks from everything from a regular legal pad, which I often have with me, often also grid paper. But I usually have paper and pen on me at all times. And especially when I'm traveling the show floor, I will often have a pocket or reporter's notebook or one of these little Rhodia books in my pocket for taking notes. I do take a fair amount of notes. One of the other practices that I really love is actually Brian Bailey. He showed me lab notebooks, which are really awesome. So they're pre-numbered, so you can refer to them later, and they're awesome. So what I would say is, and actually, by the way, love this. I'm going to mention this. Kathleen says, handwriting notes makes the info stick better, neutral impact. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There have been studies saying that the engagement of your hand in the process helps you to pull those notes in and hold on to the information better. So that's when I switched over. I still do some other handwriting. And one of the things I actually, my wife, who's doing studies for medical school, what she uses is a Rocket book that I bought her. If you don't know what a Rocket book is, it actually is a book that has little fiduciary tags on the bottom, very much like a QR code, and you write in it with an erasable pen. And so you do all of your handwriting, take a picture of it, and it pulls it immediately into your note-taking app of choice, and you can erase it. So she has the paper version of what she's taking notes on essentially, and then it's recorded, but doesn't have to keep a bunch of paper notebooks while she's just doing her notes. So Rocketbook is pretty awesome. And yeah, Kathleen says Rocketbook is good. Yeah, I like the Rocketbook. I think I may move to Rocketbook at some point because I'll say my problem right now is I'm not good at processing my notes into my online notes. And when I go to look for them in, Google Keep or Evernote or wherever I usually am, I have a couple of reasons I do those. And I also use Google Docs for stuff. When I'm using those notes, sometimes I'm searching for things that I can't find, and I realize it's because I'm remembering that I did them by hand. So yeah, Ramona says, I haven't used the field notes, even had a great leather cover made for them. Yeah, fantastic. In fact, that's a product I should be making. A little in the hoop cover for field notes would be great. And Ramona says, I have a Rocketbook too. Love note-taking options. Absolutely. Also, a great thing when you do have a drawing tablet is to take your notes on a drawing tablet too. And Letty says, always have a physical paper nearby. Carry note cards with me at all times. You guys are on the ball. Why do I have to teach you anything? But yeah, field notes are pretty awesome. There's a link to field notes in the thing. What I will say about this is that field notes also, there's all these kind of collectible versions. You can go deep down the rabbit hole of field notes. The ones that I use, This one right here, the original craft paper field note, is pretty much what I use when I use them. But I'll also use any number of junk notebooks because a lot of it is just processing. It's just letting my mind loose. And what I think is a lot of things start with writing, almost all great ideation, making of ideas start with writing or some sort of note taking. So it's useful to be able to take the notes, and it's useful to be able to like I said, not only take the notes, but be able to process and rewrite these and have these things on you. So yeah, you can go deep down the collector field notes route. In fact, this particular pack is one of the ones I'm sending is the Autumn Trilogy. I also have a limited edition NASA set of field notes because I got to talk to Aaron Draplin during a ThreadX conference, and when I bought some stuff from him and talked to him, he was kind of like, man, you're a pretty cool guy. And he stopped. He said, I don't want to pack all this up. And he's like, you want the collector one too? And he handed me a couple of really cool collector items that I'm going to send up to Jamie Chalmers if I can. But yeah, physical paper is great. Field notes are a great way to handle those. I don't always use those. And also, I'll say truthfully, if you're like me and you have that feeling like you don't want to ruin the nice notebook, go buy cheap notebooks. Doesn't matter. Go buy junk notebooks. Go buy a spiral notebook, whatever it is. But let yourself write and freely explore ideas. And I think it's a good way to handle it. So in any case, we're getting deep into bonus time. So I'm only going to go through a couple more real quick things because I think it's interesting. We did a lot of stuff today, so we're not going to go through a ton of it. In fact, what I think I'm going to say is we're probably done for the week. I think we're going to get into other stuff. One of the ones I wanted to talk about is font management. That's something we can take on another time. What I will say is that CorelDRAW has a font manager built into it, and there's a lot of open source management tools. People always ask me, and what I have to admit is, after the number of fonts I've used over the years, I often know what font I want without having to work on management. I don't have to search through fonts very often, and when I do, I kind of have an idea where I'm headed. And more these days, I go online to search for my fonts because I kind of know what categories I'm in, and if I don't have one, I'll get it. And if I do have one, I go back to my original set. So that's the hard part. Sometimes I kind of know these fonts. In fact, a friend of ours in the show, Mike Marshall Atkinson, put up a font guessing game, and he is a graphic designer, and he is a designer rather. He has a fine arts degree and he's a designer, and I think he felt a little called out because he did a font game. There's a place called, it's like FOONT, where it's a font guessing game where you can tell fonts apart from each other, typefaces apart from each other. And he was like, oh yeah, he's like, I got 1,300 on my score, pretty cool font game. And I went and did it, and I got 2,000. And he's like, man, I must be off my game or something. I can't remember what he said, but I felt bad. I'm like, you don't understand. Digitizers and embroiderers, we have to match fonts so frequently, and we have to know the difference between fonts to the point where I see the leg of a certain R and I'm like, that is Arial, that is not Helvetica, that is not Swiss, that one's for sure Arial. And so I can tell them apart because I've done a lot of having to match stuff up or figure out what fonts are and digitizing them one piece at a time. I'm like, as a graphic artist, my man, you use the font the way it came in, you use the typeface how it is. I've got to make that letter out of 5 pieces. I spent a lot of time with those fonts, Marshall. So yeah, so the one thing I will say about font management is font finding. We have discussed this on the show before, but just really super briefly, I think it's probably worthwhile to just say, yes, there are a bunch of font finding websites out there and they're useful. They are already in the links list. What I will say is that there used to only be like what the font was the biggest one. And I'm going to go ahead and kind of grab these really quick and bring them up for you. There are automatic font finding websites and people do use them. I find they're somewhat difficult, but it's another reason to be able to do photo editing because you can clean up a piece of lettering, erase everything around it, turn up the contrast, and then font finding apps like this have a better time with it. So also, if you're trying to find a font that has connected script strokes, erase a little break in the stroke between the letters, and font finding apps like this then also have a better time finding them. Not 100%, but if you absolutely must find a font, which I usually argue against depending on how many letters you have to change, if you absolutely must find a font or your source is too dirty to work with, or you need a font because you have to add something that doesn't exist in your current art, those are good ways to handle it. You have What the Font is the classic. If it's within their catalog, Font Squirrel has a font identifier I've used with the Font Spring Maturator system, and it does work. So the Font Maturator works very much like What the Font. You upload an image. There's also whatfontis.com. Once again, uploading an image and letting it identify it automatically. That's a good thing to do, but it doesn't always work. One of the other ones that I don't see people use because it's a little old school is Identifont. Identifont, it has you do it by answering questions. And this is what I'll do is just, I'll go ahead and grab this. You start in this fonts by appearance, and if you have a selection of the font in front of you, the first thing, if you only have a few letters, you can tell it, I have a limited set of letters. I only have the Takeup, right? This is all I have is these letters, and I can't see anything else but that. But I want to identify it and say, okay, well, what do we know about the font? Do they have serifs? No, they're sans serif. The K meets at a T like this. And if we keep looking, we can then start to get a closer view of what font we're looking for. So identifont.com, super useful. As we go through the questions, eventually it starts to get closer and closer, and sometimes you'll stump it like that. I just stumped it that time because I went to some shape. I'm not looking at a real font that it doesn't really have, but then say, oh, parallel verticals. Now look at all these have A's with parallels, or at least some of them. What shape is the uppercase E? Well, it looks like that is the only one in their database that has it. It does have a limited database. It's not everything you need, but for classic fonts, for fonts that are in people's old school word processing apps, are basic with computers, have come with apps forever, are old typefaces that have been converted 5 times into different fonts over the years. Identifont has gotten me there when nothing else will. So I think that's useful to say, hey, take a look at Identifont. Oh, and one other thing that's fun that's in there. Remember I told you guys about Bezier learning? The Bezier game is a fun little game that helps you to learn how to use Bezier tools more like Illustrator. But it is another fun thing that's in the links list for you to check out, because I just thought, hey, why not? We were talking about learning Beziers. Suffice it to say, guys, I think we've covered far and above more than we needed to today. You've got to see the way I make these horrific collages that I do for the Takeup. You've gotten to see the kind of notes I take. I didn't get to show you a bunch of books. Luckily, I did get to show you Von Glitchka's book. We will talk about more books because I have you'll see links in there to Eileen Lupton's Thinking with Type, which helps you learn typography. There are other books in there. There's a book called Story Brand, which I might talk about later for marketing, where we discuss how to make your customer the hero of the story and how to tell a story about products. There are lots of things we didn't get to, but we are going to get to more. I think we're going to do a favorite books and embroidery adjacent books reference section at some point here too. So if you liked this, guys, come up with some other questions. Tell me what your other favorites are, and we'll definitely do this again. I think it was a fun kind of a break. I will get more into hands-on digitizing stuff, as I often do, but I think that there's an entire kind of collage of stuff around this, and I could have brought up some of the art tools. I know I've done it before, like having color wheels on hand or color gels to view things through, or Pantone books. There's all kinds of other stuff we can talk about in the tools realm that are adjacent to embroidery that I still think are useful. But suffice it to say, I think we're good for today. That was a nice long episode. Hopefully I found you some stuff that you guys like or need. I definitely would encourage you to go check out that link, and I'll have to grab that again for Von's book. If you want to check out his book, the link is right above it, but I know the link is a little harder to see for the book deal, because that is, I believe, a limited time offer. This is the book here, bit.ly/VBT2 book deal. And I'm going to go ahead and make a banner for that real quick. But it was really cool that he offered that. And I think if you're learning, especially if you are an Illustrator person, because it really is fairly Illustrator heavy, I think it's worth taking a look at that. And it was really nice of him to share that with the reciprocators as well as the people he was actually teaching at the time. So yeah, this is that's the link for that, bit.ly/VBT2 book deal. I don't get anything about it. I just told Vaughn I would share it because I thought it was cool that there was such a nice deal on that PDF version of the book that I want to tell him about it. But yeah, I would definitely look up his content if nothing else. But yeah, all right, guys. That is it for Friday. If you have other questions, you want to talk about anything embroidery related, and honestly, if it's in the creative sphere or embroidery adjacent, if it's marketing, if it's about embroidery business, you know I'm about it. So find me in the comments. Check me out on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on YouTube. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and turn on all those notifications wherever you are when you want to hear when we're live. And let me know what you want to talk about in the future. We'll be getting to embroidery again really soon. Thank you for being here, and I cannot wait to see you again next Friday.